Hey folks, my name's Chef Jean-Paul Bourgeois, and we're here in the Louisiana Cooking Test Kitchen, your authority for all things great out the Bayou State. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a super simple buttermilk biscuit recipe that's going to blow your mind every time you eat it. I make this recipe at least twice a month. Let's get to work. First things, let's go over the ingredient list. We got some self-rising white lily flour. The self-rising part, really important because we're not going to add any baking soda or baking powder as a leavening agent to this. Some good high quality, high fat buttermilk. Some really good quality European butter. In this case, this is Kerrygold, one of my favorites to bake with and just cook with in general. A little bit of salt and some cane syrup. The really main ingredients: flour, butter, buttermilk. That's what you need to know. All right, so I'm making basically a one-time recipe here, which is a 2-cup of flour recipe. Now, what I like to do, because this flour comes pretty packed, is just have it sifted like so. And that's 1, 2. Now, you can go ahead and multiply this recipe by 2, 4, 6, whatever you want, however many people you're feeding. I make these biscuits at least twice a month at my house. My son and my wife love them, as so do I. And so that goes in there. We're done with the flour for right now. And what we want to do is just take your spoon. You can kind of just push it through that fine mesh strainer. And of course, this process of sifting the flour just really helps separate all those pieces of flour, gets all the clumps out and makes it nice and airy, just helping your biscuits become nice and fluffy and so on. This is a really simple biscuit recipe, so having good ingredients done well and executed well is really important, and what's going to make the difference between a good biscuit and a great biscuit. And honestly, folks, if you're watching this, that applies to anything you're cooking. Your ingredients are going to determine how good whatever you're making is. So make sure, if you have the resources, get the best ingredients you can. There you go. Pretty good. Now you can see right here just how kind of fluffy that flour looks. That's what we're looking for. I'm going to put aside this flour for a moment, and now I'm going to work with my butter. As you can see, I have a box grater here. This is a key ingredient to making these biscuits, and that's frozen butter. In this case, Kerrygold European butter. This is unsalted. You can see how yellow that butter is. I like to freeze it for 2 reasons. Kerrygold is high in fat, so it's softer by nature, so freezing it helps you grate it. But also, more importantly, frozen butter into this recipe really helps kind of the rise and the texture of the biscuit. I learned this from Kelly Fields, who's an incredible baker, incredible chef, and I've been using it ever since and kind of spreading the word of frozen grated butter into your biscuits. Traditional ways to take a fork or a butter cutter and kind of cut your butter into the flour like so. Grating it just helps kind of disperse that butter a little more evenly. When I get to these nubs, I like to put them in this little pot, and that's going to come in handy later. So although I'm using 2 sticks of butter in this recipe, I'm really probably only using 1.5 grated butter into this recipe. The other half a stick goes into the melted pot where I'm going to use once the biscuit comes out of the oven. So after these 2 sticks are grated, see, I'm just kind of getting it down to the point where I feel safe about my hand up against that box grater. Left with that little nub, I'm going to go right into that pot. And we're done with the kind of sticks of butter at this point. And as I just knock that out, I got a bunch of butter in here. Let's see, let's just get a spoon and get that right out. You can see that butter almost looks like it multiplied. And because I grated it, that's why. We want that frozen butter to be able to get dispersed in this flour nice and evenly. All right, so that's a chunk. I just kind of get it in there. All right, so I have the rest of this butter coming off of this pan. I'm going to use this pan to bake on as well, and just going to add the rest there into that flour. Set this off to the side, and then with a fork, I'm just going to kind of fold in that butter into that flour. And if you feel any clumps, you can use that fork to kind of just press through. All right, so this has been mixed in very nicely. And so one thing I forgot to mention, that I do like to keep my flour in the freezer and my buttermilk as cold as possible. And combining all that like as cold as possible, it really helps, in my opinion, give a good rise and a good tender biscuit. So that flour is still cold, and I also have this ice cold buttermilk. This is a cup, and I only need a half a cup here. So I'm gonna just add enough just to start seeing this dough come together. Yep, a little bit more to get to that cup measure. All right, that's looking pretty good. Now, at this point, I need to transfer this mixture onto my bench or onto my tabletop. So I'll clear out an area here where I can do that. But first, I want to make sure that I have a good coating of flour on my tabletop. That flour will inevitably become part of the dough as we roll it out. Now, this is a kind of a small recipe in terms of the quantity that we're making. So I'm gonna just dump it out into this. You see, this is not combined at all. And really, the cardinal rule of biscuits is to not overwork. So again, I'm just bringing in those ingredients into the bowl first before I start to kind of start creating this dough ball. Now, let's talk about gluten for a second. Right? We are developing gluten as we're working this dough, and that's a good thing. Gluten is structure. Biscuits need structure too, but we don't want to overwork, right? So I'm just gonna, once I start getting that dough starting to come together, it's not fully together, it's cracking around the edges. I'm gonna start to really just kind of fold things over, just creating layers of that biscuit. Just folding it over, and where I have low excess, I'll just do like that. Add it to it, and I just fold it over like this, and then I'll just kind of keep turning it and folding it into those third little envelopes, and then pressing it down. I'm gonna take that residual flour, make sure my hands are nice and coated and not sticky, turn, and then get another layer out of it. As I'm folding this flour, I can feel, making biscuits is just as much about feel as it is about the recipe. And so because the butter you may use may differ, the buttermilk or even the flour, you really want to make sure that the biscuit's starting to feel the way you want it to. And the way it's feeling right now, I'm developing some gluten. So when I press down, there's like a little tiny bounce back, but not quite enough yet. I want to find a nice balance of bounce back from gluten development while also keeping my layers kind of going and making it as tender as possible. Notice you don't see a dough roller out on the table because I don't typically use one. I like hand pressing it down. Now you can see, like when I press down, you get that little bit of bounce back, and that dough starting to develop a really nice structure. So at this point, I'm just gonna start forming that dough to get those sides nice and smooth, like so, and just kind of spinning around, then flatten it. Kind of patting those edges and then flatten it. And really, I'm happy with the amount of times I've been able to fold it and develop the dough. I like using my hand to kind of, as opposed to a dough roller. And this is for a number of reasons. One, it just feels a little more homemade when I have the divots of my hand and my knuckles kind of in that dough. But also when I go ahead and brush that biscuit with butter, once it comes out of the oven, those little crevices and little dimples really help kind of capture that butter. That's just one way. And it just feels kind of like a mama made them or a grandma made them when you're using your hands like this. All right, now I'm just trying to get that dough nice and like formed so I can get as many cuts out of it as possible. Nice and even. I don't know, I would say that's 1.25 inches about high. That's it. That's my biscuit dough. That's simple. But the technique isn't done yet. What I like to do is just take a little pile of flour. I take my biscuit cutter and I'll roll it in my flour. And from there, I'll start cutting. Trying to get as much as I can, and I go straight down. I don't twist, I don't put my hand on top, I go straight down and straight up. Give it a little push out, and that's my biscuit. And between each one, I go back into my little reserve flour. I coat the inside, and I go another cut down. I just gently push that out with my fingers. And those are the biscuits that I'm gonna end up baking. All right, when it comes to your second rolls, right? Don't throw this out. This dough is still good. It's already been worked once. This is your first cuts right here, these 5 biscuits, but you still have this dough right here. So what I like to do to combine those, I like to just kind of fit them into their low points, trying to kind of puzzle them together. And then as best I can, try to get that to form another dough ball without overworking it so much. So I need to develop it a little bit because I need to kind of fold those pieces in together. So these could come out just a touch more tougher, if you will, maybe not as tender as those first cuts, but still a worthy biscuit to be consumed. So I don't like to throw them out. Of course, you can always use them for other things. You can make this into like a cobbler topping or some type of other dessert. If you want to save those second rolls, I always bake all my dough off and I freeze the cooked dough later on, because then I use them to make like turkey gravy for Thanksgiving. I always fold in kind of cooked biscuits into my gravy. Maybe I'll show that recipe at some point down the road. So on that second cut, I have it where we want. It's not going to be as pretty as those, but we're going to give them a cut anyway. There we go. All right, you can save this and bake it off just as a freestanding piece of dough. Before I put those into the oven, I like to just give them a little brush off of any excess flour that might burn or become too colored on top. From here, we're back at the cookie tray. Now, in biscuit making, as in all cooking, but baking in general, the details matter. All right, so I have a non-stick tray. I don't need any butter on the bottom. If I'm using cast iron or a metal tray, I may think about some Pam or another smear of butter on the bottom. But I'm using non-stick. It has a little bit of residual butter on there from me grating it, but overall, this is where I want to be. Now you have a couple different options. If you put your biscuits on this tray spaced out like so, you'll get a crustier biscuit on the exterior. If you place them closer together to bake like so, then you get a more tender exterior because it's using all the humidity in the cooking surface that it's touching kind of together to kind of build up and cook. I like cooking them closer together. So I leave like a tiny bit of space in between. You can kind of see that in the overhead shot right there. They're close together, but they're not exactly touching, all right? And that's how I'm gonna bake those biscuits. Whether I fill up that pan or I leave them just like that, my biscuits are that far apart when they go in the oven. You can tell like they have those little bitty imperfections that really make them feel like I've added a lot of love, time, and effort into, because I did. All right, so we got a preheated oven at 475 degrees. These biscuits take anywhere from 9 minutes to 12 minutes to cook, depending on your oven. You wanna make sure you get in the center of that oven and then give it a flip halfway through. All right, our biscuits have been in for about 12 minutes. Now, what I like to do to finish them, remember that butter we set aside? Well, that's right here. And give them a nice pinch of salt. I like a good salty top on my biscuit. All right, I don't know if I'm alone in the world in that or not, but a good salty top is one of those things I really love. Let's see, so I'm just getting, this butter has already been melted. Good hit of salt in there, and then I'm just gonna liberally just get them right on top of those biscuits. And I wanna do this while they're hot. I wanna use have a hot biscuit with hot butter when I do this brushing, excuse me. I'm just gonna go all around the sides, everywhere I can. All right, another little layer. And that's our buttermilk biscuit. Now, the way my mama used to make biscuits or dress her biscuits was just split open. You can see all the layers, by the way, that we built. That's a sign of a well-layered and gonna be tender biscuit. And my knife can just glide right through there. And then she would just cut them open, a little pat of butter right on top. And then with some cane syrup, she would eat them kind of like pancakes, right? And just butter on top of that biscuit with a nice drizzle of cane syrup. And she'd literally, like this, just cut into them and eat them with a fork. And I just love this style. Of course, it reminds me of her, but what a good bite. Perfect. Y'all gonna have to leave me alone with these biscuits. My name's Chef Jean Paul, and I am out.